as with this morning, I'm just holding the time space and we'll be introducing the speakers. Both speakers will speak and then come to the front to answer questions. There will be a roving mic, so if you have a question, please wait until the mic gets to you so that we can have your question recorded on the video as well. So I'm very happy to introduce Libita Sibungu, who is going to be our next speaker. Libita is an interdisciplinary artist living and working in West Cornwall. I was talking about the Welsh language earlier, and my head's in Wales. And she's building environments that weave decolonial narratives into installation and poetic environments, with a particular focus on collaboration. She's the recipient of the 2022 Arts Foundation Future Award. So over to you, Libita. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I haven't done one of these things for a while. It's been online for quite a long time, so it's nice to be with humans. I'm going to try and bring this on time, so I'll try and be at a pace. Thank you for the introduction. I come from the sea, from the Zambezi and the Red Rivers, from the stars in the ocean, in the sky and on the earth. I am meteorite, soil and water, salt and iron, dust, energy, light, love, as all are we, interbeings, interconnected. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, page 115. Quote, certainly there are very real differences between us of race, age and sex, but it is not those differences between us that are separating us. It is rather our refusal to recognize those differences and to examine the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects upon human behavior and expectation. End quote. The land doesn't stop being when it meets the sea. It goes under, where once perhaps it was above. And so sea and land are not separate, they are one, holding all of time, before and after and after and after. I grew up wondering how I came to be at this peninsula here, Black, mixed, African, Celtic, Cornish, different, so alone and yet so at home. And how then has my vision expanded, changed, the optics hybridized, compressed and fractured like a prism shooting out light, futuristic vision? What good can come from speaking out of or from or about my vantage point? What a phenomenon it is to be born at a particular moment in space and time for us to be here now. I think about holes, the whole self, black holes in land, mind, spirit and body, time and minerals. What great lengths the human race has gone to in finding shiny small thing in, displacing earth and people, carving out and cutting up land, colonialism, capitalism, and how these holes become mountains, displaced. I am interested in transformation, memory, trauma, life, death, being, and how moments before our lifetime were already inscribed in us. How do these marks register over time? Deep time, strata, lineage, like beautiful haunting wounds, becoming scars on the body and the psyche on the earth. And so back to shiny small thing, shimmering and glimmering, tin, copper, zinc, gold, diamond, uranium, Earth's core, my core. What of the light that shelters in darkness, that is protected by darkness and shadows? What happens when this dark light finds a hole and is exposed to the elements? And so this image here is of me carrying this sculpture reminiscent of a rock. The title of the performance is In and Between Place and Home. First performed at the Diaspora Pavilion during the 57th Venice Biennale in 2017. I walked from 6 till 8 a.m. in the morning in Venice in a type of procession, perhaps protest, perhaps thinking about work, labour, class, race, African diasporic peoples. The performance then travelled to South London Gallery, where I invited 5 classically trained Black performers, dancers, opera singers, violinists, into a type of dystopic opera with me. Next slide, please. Finally, this performance finished in Penzance at the Tremonest Sculpture Gardens. This is me walking along Venice. Next slide, please. And here I carry this rock, finishing in this group exhibition at the Tremonest Gallery. Next slide, please. And so at the end of 27, after this performance, I was invited to develop my first solo exhibition and a major new commission, which was with Gasworks, a gallery in London. The title of this exhibition became Quantum Ghost, which was presented in 2019. And so across 2018, I embarked on explorations and experimentations to find out what this exhibition could be. And I was guided by this knowing that this needed to speak to my family history and heritage and to sound out the silences and the gaps in my memory and ancestry. So I began a pilgrimage to find out what had happened to my father, who was Namibian, and along the way discovering so much more, including my mother's story, who was Cornish, maiden name Rowe. Next slide, please. My voice is so deep it is buried in the ground. I love this lyric, I love this song, and I love this album. It's by an artist called Serpent with Feet, from the Morning Song from the album Soil, which came out in 2018. As part of this exhibition, I was fortunate enough to receive funding and given the time, a year or more, to work on this exhibition. And so I was thinking about death and memorial and collective and intergenerational healing. And I was listening to music and reading books and visiting archives that reflected my research. I went on residencies in London with Gasworks Gallery for a few months. I went to primary in Nottingham on a mini residency. I went to the Camden School of Mines, the Black Cultural Archives. I went on residency to Bag Factory in Johannesburg for a few months, and I ended up in Windhoek, Namibia, where I also worked with archives. Next slide, please. My dad, Stevenson Sibungu, came from Namibia, which is in southern Africa. He came to England during the 1980s whilst in exile, as many Namibians were, at a time when Namibia was under apartheid rule by South Africa up until 1990. My father was a member of SWAPO, Southwest African People's Organization, which fought for Namibia's independence during the liberation struggle, the war. And he was able to study mining engineering in his years of exile, which brought him to London and eventually Cornwall. This is a picture of him down a mine. I believe this could be a Cornish mine where he did a placement. And so I was born in 1987, and my father was repatriated back to Namibia in 1989. On the eve of Namibia's birth, he went missing shortly after from my life and was presumed dead. I couldn't cognitively remember him, but photos became an important portal into a time, evidencing our time together when I was a baby. Next slide, please. I knew I wanted to follow my father's footsteps and trace his journey, to find out not only what had happened to him, but also to reveal something to me about me, my heritage, and to release myself from this painful amnesia I was suffering from. I had to go under and go deep. And so this is a picture of me as a baby with my mum and my 2 aunties on a beach in Cornwall, as you can tell. Next slide. And so I started to think about my personal archive, photos. I started to ask my mum questions about these early years, about her love for my father. She also had gaps in her memory, perhaps symptoms of trauma and survival. And so I thought, what about asking her about her childhood? What was it like to grow up here? What was the landscape like? What was it like? What was her relationship to these kind of mining ruination sites? And she started talking about the Red River in Godrevy. And Mum started telling me how she played in it as a child and how there was this kind of red magical clay. Stained from the tin mining upstream, the iron present oxidizes and the water turns red. Over time, this blocks oxygen and light. There's something about that toxicity, about that memory that spoke to me. And I started to record these conversations, going to pubs, asking other people in Cornish pubs about their experiences of the landscapes, trying to think about this kind of poetic frame. Next slide, please. And so I embarked on this pilgrimage. I needed to move my body in the landscape, starting in Penzance and doing the coastal walk along to Zena, looking at these engine houses and imagining holes in the earth, looking at where the land turned red from the iron ore. Next slide. Armed with a sound recorder with pockets, I started to collect the earth and put it in my bag, started to collect the sounds. Next slide. And also armed with my dearest friend, Nina Royal. We took on this pilgrimage together. Next slide. And so part of my personal archive also included my inherited archive, paper archive from my father, full of letters and correspondence during his time in exile to my mother, love letters, magazines, political papers. Next slide. And so I photocopied these magazines and these papers and put them on the wall in my studio, again, thinking about this resurrection, this feeling, this language of mining, of resistance, of poetics. And this action on Namibia magazine kept coming up. Next paper. And I started to look at the dates, 1990, independence and reconstruction, Namibia is born. And then my father's letters dated 89. Next slide. And I started to look at the language, the role of women in reconstruction and development, Namibia. South Africa first occupied Namibia in the request of Britain during the First World War when it was a German colony. Since then, they have imported all the worst features of the apartheid system, which in turn has attracted multinational capital. British-owned companies involved in the plunder of Namibia's natural wealth include Rio Tinto Zinc, who operate the notorious Rossing uranium mine. Next slide. And so how to bring these things together, I could feel something coming together, these topographies, these politics, my experience, ancestry. And I was lucky enough to be able to go to Namibia for the first time. And so when I got to Namibia, I carried on in my pilgrimage, taking to the ground and collecting shells and earth. Next slide. Meeting with generous people that I hadn't met before, having no connection with Namibia really. And we started to document these active mining sites. This is Walvish Bay in Namibia, which is an active mining site where the water turns pink. Next slide. And I started to think about composition and shimmers and my body in the landscape. What do these minerals look like if they're held up to the light? Next slide. I also went to the National Archives of Namibia and typed in the word mining. Came up with thousands of black and white photos. This is a colonial archive, so it depicts these black people as black subjects. A very violent frame. Next slide. Hand mining, hand sieving. Next slide. And this image became of particular importance to me, of these black workers bent over, digging what looks like to me graves, but actually salt, creating mountains behind them, but making holes. Barefooted in this salt, in the heat, painful. And then this white overseer with shoes on, sunglasses, standing on the opposite side of this image, protected, still, watching. I started to think about the sounds of resistance, the sounds of lament. What were the hums? What were the noises they could do in unison, the songs to just be, to survive, to be together? Next slide. And so I came back to England with all of this stuff I'd been gathering. I painted ferociously and wrote a long-form poem that I broke. And then, next slide. The show opened in London at Gasworks. Quantum Ghost was born. I created these large-scale photograms, which you can see in the background, which hold the minerals I was collecting. I then invited 3 artists to collaborate with me on this kind of sound piece I wanted to make. Joel Thompson here created a bass composition, which was an articulation of uranium as it decays and turns into lead. Hannah Catherine Jones, a classically trained singer, worked the theremin and created this vocal lament. And Demelza Toy Toy worked on these intricate, intimate sounds of my body in the archives, my mouth, this kind of bodily sound, this intimacy. Next slide. And we created this performance that was kind of just a presentation of these hidden collaborations as a closing for this exhibition. And I made this sound installation lit with red light, 5 speakers. Next slide. And the exhibition then toured to a gallery in Bristol called Spike Island, where it became bigger. And I decided to make 10 new photograms. And photograms remove the camera. So you work directly with this photo-sensitive paper. And I started to put crystals, materials, sand, everything I've been collecting directly onto this paper. And then in the darkroom, the light exposes this material. And so it's fast, improvised work in the darkroom. And then each print was hand processed. They're built to the scale of my body as far as I could go. And then when they go from the floor and they come up onto the walls, they become like a kind of map or a series of scores. Next slide, please. And so then from far away, they look like these kind of cosmic workings, these images of wholes, of a greater idea about time, deep time. Next slide. But then when you stand up close, they're full of these fragments, black tourmaline, pins, commemorative Namibian stamps, independence and reconstruction, photocopies of these magazines inherited from my father, broken glass. Next slide. Sand, gravel, shells. Next slide. And my father's handwriting, letters. Give her the morale you have. Pins. Next slide. And as you walk around the gallery, you come to this entrance. Next slide. Perhaps an ear canal, a cave, made of cob, a traditional material indigenous to here, to Africa, perhaps a homestead. Next slide. And as you enter in, you walk over this gravel, Cornish gravel, 27 tons of Cornish gravel. Your body implicated in the sound and the experience of the cave, the fugu, the dwelling. Next slide. And as you stand in the middle, you then listen to these 3 speakers holding this broken poem, a pitched down monologue, speaking about time, held by these field recordings and these sounds and these archival documents. Hidden in the darkness, a deep bass sound that you feel in your body, and other speakers bringing forth this siren-like lament. And so you stand in this red heart center, and this 21-minute looped audio piece starts with the line, "In the beginning, there was rupture." Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Continuing this conversation, I think, from the morning around the radical and radioactive potential of the archive. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Shelley Trower, who is Professor Emerita of English Literature. She grew up in Cornwall. Her recent projects have involved memories of fiction and living libraries. Her 2015 book, Rocks of Nation, The Imagination of Celtic Cornwall, is here circulating around the room, so do take a look at it. And she's awaiting publication. It's just about in print. Her latest book is Sound, Writing, Voices, Authors, and Readers of Oral History. Over to you, Shelley.
So yeah, my way into the subject of Cornish contemporary identities is rocks, as this slide may indicate. And I thought a lot about rocks over the past 15, 20 years, particularly when I was writing this book got more rocks on the cover there, some granite rocks near Land's End. It's very hard to sum up. It was like 6+ years writing it. But one of the major themes really is how the geological basis of our landscapes contributes to Cornish identity and other kinds of identities as well. But yeah, the book does focus on Cornwall, but it also touches on other places. As far as Tibet, there's a brief mention of Tibet in there. So yeah, Cornwall is often experienced as granite. That's one of the kind of predominant rocks here. Can I have a slide there? Yeah, there's a map of where granite reaches the surface in Cornwall. It is the red patches, and where it's deeper under the surface is the other colour. Don't know what you might call that. Can you read the words there? Don't think I need to read them for you, but yeah, many of you will know this already, I'm sure. So yeah, often when you're in Cornwall, granite is beneath your feet somewhere, even if it's not evident on the surface. But of course, there's many other kinds of rocks, but in the short time I have today, I'm going to focus on granite. And then the next slide is somebody who identifies with this kind of granite core. We don't have to agree with this or share this feeling or anything. It's just one example of somebody describing Cornishness as a kind of granite. So yeah, this is Bernard Deacon, who was with the Institute of Cornish Studies for quite a time. He describes how Cornwall's central spine is made up of those granite outcrops that we saw in the last slide, from Bodmin Moor to Land's End. And it is said, he says, that every Cornish person also has a granite core, easygoing on the surface. We can be obstinate and unmovable if pushed too far. We don't have to feel that we share that. It's just one example. But yeah, I also found this a bit interesting because land is kind of bodily with its backbone, as well as kind of human bodies identifying here with the land. Granite is very important to Cornwall, I think, partly obviously because of the mining history. It's provided the tin and other ore resources, so historically there's obviously that huge heritage. Also, granite has itself been mined, as in the slide at the beginning, which is also the next slide. Yep, there we go, some granite quarry from Delank mine, somewhere near Bodmin Moor, I think. As well as the mining industry, there's the tourist industry. So granite obviously underpins some of the kinds of dramatic landscapes that Cornwall is known for, as in the examples on this next slide. Thank you, Sobe. Bodmin Moor, Roughtor, and, oh, my mind's gone blank. Somewhere, cliffs, Land's End. Yeah, that kind of thing, yeah. So two very, well, kind of comparable landscapes. And yeah, it's granite's resilience, isn't it, that keeps it, I think, going both as a substance and also as part of some people's Cornish identities. It's a sense of continuity, perhaps something stable on which we can rely to some extent. So yeah, these are the shapes of something that's survived for millennia, through millennia of rain and wind and sea as well. And such landscapes are often described as sublime, they evoke awe. It's kind of the temporality of what's involved there is kind of beyond what we can imagine. It's beyond quite what the mind can grasp. So a lot of what my book is about is that kind of juxtaposition of materiality, granite being kind of one of the most material, hard, real objects you can possibly have. And on the other hand, it's connected with kind of imagination and spirituality. So often there's ghost stories around these landscapes, ideas, because of the timelessness of it in a way, the idea that kind of ancient people may survive in ghostly form around these landscapes. So this kind of juxtaposition of materiality and spirituality. And my book also touches on environmental issues. And I want to talk more about that today because it's in one chapter mainly, but considering how ever more urgent, desperately urgent it is to deal with the environmental crises, I wanted to think a bit more about it in that context today. And in one way, I want to think about granite as something that may have a relative degree of, it may have a chance of kind of withstanding what is to come, rising sea levels, more extreme weather, and all the rest of what's kind of already upon us to some extent. So granite may become more important perhaps in that other landscapes are less stable. So I was walking along Pras Sands the other day, and how you can see how the kind of cliff edge is falling in there, and some gardens and fences, and how the coast path has given way. So a lot of landscapes are more vulnerable to kind of the environmental conditions, whereas Penwith and this kind of landscape is more stable relatively. So that sense of a kind of relatively invulnerable Cornwall, I think, that granite may embody. I've also been thinking a bit about how granite rocks are associated with ancient or pre-industrial traditions and ways of being, with ways of connecting with landscapes that don't just involve exploiting them, as in the case of mining, where kind of the land is in front of you and you'll map it out, and the mineral areas were all mapped out as something separate and to be kind of exploited and mined. So some people have reached for a kind of connection with pre-industrial ancestors, like the ancient stone circles on Bodmin Moor. I think I've got an image of them. Yeah, actually they're somewhere else. The next one. Yeah, I thought I'd cut that one out. Anyway, yeah, Bodmin Moor. The Hurlers, I think. Yeah, good, okay. So there's a kind of Cornish spiritualism that pits ancient traditions against the modern and the industrial. And we can find this in the work of, say, Donald R. Raw on the next slide. There's a few examples of the kind of spooky stuff. Actually, yeah, they've all got rocks. I didn't actually plan that, but now I look at it and the covers have each got kind of rocky backgrounds as well. And actually bones and rocks are often kind of equated. So yeah, there's many story collections like this. There was a while in Tesco's I kept bumping into these little versions of that last one. Anyway, yeah, they come up in surprising places, but yeah, there's a lot of this kind of work that went on since about the 1970s, I think, Donald R. Raw, Michael Williams and others. And there's lots of examples in there, but one of the ideas that sometimes comes up is stones having energies which people might connect with. Some such stories strike me as quite New Age, often in the kind of ideas of alternative spirituality. So the New Age as this sort of disparate movement that grew up in the 1970s. And in recent decades has sometimes made more environmental claims of like cherishing the earth and being in tune with nature. And the argument being that this is kind of needed more and more in the face of environmental crises, that we need to have a different attitude to the environment and connect with it. The final example I'm going to take of this kind of work is Cheryl Straffen, a Cornish writer who publishes the biannual magazine of ancient stones and sacred sites in Cornwall, Manvro? Is that how you say it? It's on the next slide. So this is Cornish for Stones of Our Motherland. And it's been going since 1986. And it's still going now. And the very first issue refers to the many ancient sites in Cornwall and the importance of protecting the environment, which she said was increasingly under threat from nuclear waste at the time and from landowners and speculators, I quote, who would turn our country into just another part of England. So there's a Cornish nationalist tone here with the use of country, implication it's not England. And Straffen thinks that the Celtic earth goddess has survived in Cornwall, and it has become a major focus in her work in books like Pagan Cornwall and Pagan Cornwall, Land of the Goddess, second edition in 2012. So it's all still going strong. And she claims that ancient ways are still alive here, as is the spiritual essence of the goddess, and that she and others in her circle kind of connect with this. And feel a kind of at oneness with the natural world. So it's a way of thinking about human individuals and land as not separate, but as part of one another, and very different, as I was saying, as a different way of thinking about the land as something to be mined. I find some of it problematic where it can exclude people, and I'm not actually very spiritual myself in this way at all, but I was interested in thinking about environmental crisis and whether it's worth thinking about perhaps more inclusive ways of making that connection with the earth. On the other hand, and this is my last leg now, it was actually prompted by a Facebook post on Sophie's page. But anyway, lithium mining. So we need practical solutions as well. So we need to harness solar and wind and wave power. Cornwall obviously has a lot of wind and wave and rain power. It'd be great if we could harness that as well. Anyway, so yeah, some landscapes change. You know, wind farms, actually where I grew up, it was around Allet, Shortlands End, somewhere around there. A lot of farmland became wind farms, so the landscape changed a lot. But to get back to granite, yeah, lithium is in granite rocks, isn't it? Yes, it's found in granite rocks. So there's also this new possibility of lithium mining. And there's the two companies, British Lithium and Cornish Lithium companies, which expect to begin mining in the next 3 to 5 years. And with the need to reduce fossil fuels, it's hugely in demand, isn't it, at the moment, lithium to fuel, to make batteries, rechargeable batteries that are necessary for cars and phones and laptops and all of those sorts of things. So it seems very necessary at the moment for a greener world. And it could, apparently, the Cornish lithium could provide 2/3 of UK demand. So it seems to have huge potential. And yet, so far, lithium mining has been very damaging of local environments. There's a slide on the next, yeah, this is Chile, I think. So it can be very damaging. And it's also important to involve local communities from the outset to ensure that jobs go to local peoples rather than the wealth just going elsewhere, partly because Cornwall needs those kinds of jobs rather than those that depend on the tourist industry, which are so seasonal and low paid usually. Okay, so to sum up, yeah, I've thought then about rocks in my book up till about 2000, and it was a very historical, it went right back to kind of the 18th century and Humphrey Davy and all of that, and the mining then, and it came up to about 2000, so I wanted to kind of push it forward a bit today. And so just to briefly recap, there's the 3 ways I thought about it is, one is as something that can withstand environmental pressures, and then also as an image of ancient ways that might get us kind of back before mining and how we might reconnect with the earth and all that kind of thing. And then thirdly, actually whizzing past mining to a kind of post-new kind of mining with lithium and how we might need granite to support a greener future, but again, proceeding with caution. So I think that's my 15 minutes.
Thank you so much for another great paper. Can I invite both of you to take the middle of this space? We have about 10 minutes for questions because we'll need to break at 22 to have a 5-minute break while we set up for the panel discussion. But I want, really interested also in both of your contributions about the labor that rocks do. So rocks are doing a lot of work. They're doing the work of language. They're doing the work of standing in as proxies for human bodies. They are also transformative. There's also the labor that other people make rocks do. So that sense in Bernard Deacon about the granite core of a Cornish person and that sort of lineage of 20th century characterization of people according to landscape and geography and geology and what's included and excluded within those framings. Can you be Cornish without having granite in your heart? Those are maybe questions we'll come back to, but opening it up to you, who has some questions for Libita and Shelley? Yes, Fran.
I have one
there's a mic for you.
Oh, sorry, thank you. I have one for Shelley. So you mentioned how, was it lithium? Was it lithium you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, how it can benefit because of our kind of crisis environmentally, but how it can be destructive to our landscape. And I was just kind of interested in your opinion on which might be kind of more important in the kind of wider breadth of things, whether like, I can't get these words out, sustaining our landscape or digging for lithium was more important.
Mm-hmm. There's so much to weigh up, isn't there? And I'm definitely not an expert on this, but it seems from what I could gather that lithium has become, mining it has become less damaging to environments. So maybe weighed up against the need for it and the wealth it may bring if done properly. Yeah, I can't really make that call, I don't think, but I think it would definitely, I'd be open to it personally.
Yeah, I don't have the knowledge, so, you know.
Yeah. Does anyone else think?
Over here, if you wait 1 second for Mike. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Mike. Oh, that is so cute. Wow. Very rock and roll, thank you. I've lost my thread. What was I going to say? I think, thinking about specifically electric vehicles, one of the things that bothers me is neo-colonialism, in that, you know, we in the West will benefit from running environmentally responsible electric cars, but actually we are then exporting the ecological damage to other parts of the world. And I think if we do have significant resources of lithium, for example, in this country, then we should use our own resources. And we should also find ways to keep some of the profits within our society. And I'm thinking particularly the French model, where if a parish has a business within its parish boundaries, then a proportion of their equivalent of corporation tax stays within the parish. So you will often find, you know, a French parish with an industrial estate will also have wonderful community facilities that we could only dream about. But yeah, I just worry about us benefiting, but at somebody else's cost.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
And actually, can I add a bit? I thought a bit more about what you were saying, Fran. And I think we do seem to need this lithium, but also I think massive lifestyle changes. What I wouldn't want to say is we can just produce lithium and carry on. Because actually, I think public transport and all of this, not everyone will be able to afford electric cars. So I think there needs to be really massive transformation. But nevertheless, lithium still seems to have its use. And like you say, I think it presumably would be greener, again, to produce it nearer to where it's used rather than transport it.
Survey.
Hi, thank you both. I wanted to make a connection between both your talks there, just in the that Bernard Deacon comment about the granite. I've always spoken about granite in my core.
Okay.
And that sort of stopping me from blowing over. So I wanted to ask Libita about that, and when you're like how that chimes with you. There seem, obviously there's loads of granite in your work, and you spoke loads about various minerals and rocks there. So I wondered about that connection of a mineral or a stone, not necessarily granite, being like bodily or...
Yeah, it's funny, when I think of granite, I think of like houses and houses that sweat and that you paint them white every year because they leak and they're damp. It's really cool. Yeah, so immediately my mind was thinking about domestic, what happens when you try and live in granite. Yeah, and I suppose for me there's something interesting, and like I said, about kind of this Earth's core, this heat coming from like uranium, and then relating that to like the body. And when I think about these rocks, there is just kind of a tactile understanding, of like, I think we've joked about kind of these granite lumps. I think when I started to make that work in 2017 with the performances with the rocks in between place and home, I started to kind of look around where I was living in West Cornwall and seeing these lumps of granite everywhere, and just kind of started to find a bit of a humour in it, because I kind of loved the way that these lumps of granite were just kind of denoting like car park. Don't go there, big lump of granite. And I kind of just started to find a lot of like humour in that kind of most practical thing ever, and the simplest thing of like putting this lump there. Not so much, with the kind of Neolithic monuments, because I didn't start visiting those sites until I was much older. I didn't have access, even though I grew up here. That wasn't part of like leisure of what we did. In my family, the friends that I knew, we didn't kind of access those sites that tourists and lots of people come to see. So it's more like this kind of domestic, inherent relationship that I had with rock that I think came from towns and from homes. But I don't know what's within me apart from all of the things I listed at the start. Lots of different things. But I also like when maybe to finish, is like when I've read about kind of miners, I like this intuition between the body and rocks. And when you hear of like miners, Cornish miners finding their way like before high tech, it was a very physical thing, and here I think why we were such the epicenter of mining and tin, because the rocks have all these kind of cracks in them, which then would hold all this tin. So they would follow with their hands, to be able to follow these kind of veins of the earth and be like, we're on track. So I like that embodied knowledge.
Other questions? Yes, at the back. Just wait for the mic, thanks.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed both of your talks, and it's got me thinking a huge amount. And I think thinking about both of them, I think particularly yours, Libita, but also I really like the juxtaposition of the two, Shelley. So it just made me reflect an awful lot about folding, or the way that rocks aren't just our surroundings, but are also kind of folded into us, whether it's kind of into our imaginative world, but also kind of like physically, right? At a molecular level, we're all made up of minerals, which is like also the rocks. I don't know. I'm just like having this like slight spin out moment where I'm thinking about where the rocks stop and we start, or whatever. But I don't know. Yeah, that's just what I ended up thinking about.
That was my intention. that was the goal. No, I like that folding. It is infinite, and I enjoy the different perspectives on the question of where do you come from, beyond this living time. And I also really enjoyed us speaking next to each other, because we haven't ever spoken next to each other, and I don't think we've sat with each other's practices particularly. So I enjoyed the folding of like listening to you, and yeah, I like that notion of folding.
Yeah, there's definitely rock conversations we could continue to have.
There's a lot of rock conversation.
Thank you. I'm probably not going to say this very well because I'm not very good at speaking, but the lady mentioned folding of rocks, and I found that quite interesting. The movement, the tectonic plates, and the compression, and the seams, the veins, and how we're relating it to the human, and you have these deep ancestral feelings or veins, or I'm not quite sure the word, these very, I don't know whether innate's even the right word, it just made me think of the connection between the human and the rock, and the deep-seated things we carry, which are compressed or repressed. It's just interesting. Made me think of something, interesting.
Yeah, I really appreciate that observation, because I think about that a lot, compression. I think for me it's interesting to think the poetics of, if I could think through the perspective of a mineral, then I could start to connect that to things around trauma and suppression and emotion.
Yes, Maria.
Well, again, I don't know if it's exactly a question, but thank you both for your presentations. That was very powerful. But you both mentioned this idea of ghosts, and of course, Libita with the quantum ghosts, and you were talking, Shelley, about sort of the landscape. And so I was wondering if you both had anything more to say about ghosts and kind of like the haunted landscape in relation perhaps to mining or to stones and minerals.
Do you want to go first? Or?
I can.
I'm just immediately thinking of lots of folk tales with ghosts, and I think I was quite fascinated. I nearly called my book Rocks and Ghosts, actually, so I should have a lot to say. But yeah, so from about chapter 3 onwards, I start kind of moving on from rocks, because the first ones are really about the history of geology and properly rocky. And then I start moving into folklore more and ghosts and things. I suppose one thing that strikes me is how many different kinds of literature you find ghosts in, from sort of folk tales to D.H. Lawrence and modernist type stuff, through to the New Age stuff. It seems to be very prevalent in lots of different literatures. And I think, again, it's that sense of crossing time in a very different way from the material way that, I just got really fascinated with that juxtaposition. Maybe your turn.
Obviously there's kind of, for me, thinking about ghosts in terms of ancestors, and what that kind of means when you think about a past, but then there's still something living. But then also, I suppose, thinking of, like sacred sites and the ways that they're recorded or can hold memory energetically. There's something like living, I think, within the notion of a ghost, a different temporality, a kind of speculative or spectre that's interesting. And also this kind of sound, quite interested in like archaeoacoustics, the sound of sacred sites and these different ways that sounds could be possibly articulated, being it from like ringing stones and different kind of indigenous communities, but also, I guess, through like ritual as well, the notion of kind of bringing forth some spirit or some energy. But I don't know, there's something there. Obviously my title was Ghost, but I'm still enjoying thinking through that kind of temporality of it, I think.